The blast does not echo. It collapses into the snow like a secret being buried, fast, violent, and final. White powder drifts upward in a slow, weightless curtain, and beneath it, Gunnery Sergeant Elena Hayes opens her eyes to a world that has gone completely wrong. The smell reaches her first. Burnt diesel, scorched metal, the sharp chemical bite of explosive residue hanging in air that is already 20 below zero. Her cheek rests against something cold and wet, snow melting briefly against her skin before refreezing into a crust of ice that pulls at the edge of her jaw. Her ears ring with a thin electric whine. Where radio chatter once lived, there is only that sound, high and hollow and relentless, like a wire pulled too tight. She does not panic. She breathes. One inhale. The cold fills her lungs like glass shards. She catalogs damage the way she was trained to do, the way that saved her life more than once, the way that is saving it right now. Her right hand moves. Slowly, deliberately. It finds the rifle. The polymer grip is rough under numb fingers, familiar the way a good handshake is familiar, firm, honest, grounding. Her thumb finds the ejection port, 1 round. She already knew. She had counted every shot she fired before the convoy burned. But confirmation matters. Confirmation is the difference between a soldier and a body. Below the ridge, dark figures move through the wreckage. Their boots crunch across ice with a rhythm that is unhurried. Patient. These men are not rushing toward anything. They are moving the way apex predators move, with the total, settled confidence of something that is never needed to hurry because nothing has ever gotten away. They are hunting. She watches them through bent armor plating pressing into her shoulder. Wind drags loose snow across the valley floor. Somewhere far below, a piece of loose gear taps against broken metal with a soft, rhythmic sound, like a clock that refuses to stop. She has 1 round. And she has already started thinking. Fictional stories. Real courage. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment from Hidden Sniper Stories. And drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Memory surfaces through pain the way it always does, uninvited, honest, and sharp at the edges. The smell of gun oil, the dry, clean crack of bolt-action rifles firing across long distances. Dust rising off training lanes at Fort Benning in the Georgia heat, hanging in the air like something the earth exhaled. Elena remembers the controlled silence of sniper school, not as a place, but as a feeling. The feeling of everything irrelevant falling away until only the shot remained. Gunnery Sergeant Elena Hayes, 34 years old. Joint attachment between the U.S. Army and the United States Marine Corps, embedded within a sniper support element operating under winter warfare protocols in the Alaska Range near Denali National Park. On paper, her file is a quiet document. It does not shout. Most files like hers never do. She completed the Joint Sniper course, one of only 17 women in U.S. military history to do so at the time of her certification. She was not celebrated for it. She simply moved to the next training cycle. Before the exercise began, at the base camp briefing outside the park's southern boundary, 2 members of the OPOR role-playing team had laughed when her name appeared on the opposing sniper manifest. She had heard it. She always heard things. One of them, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant named Briggs, had leaned toward his partner and said something low and dismissive with the word paperwork in it and the word mistake. She had looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she had returned to her map. She had noted, in those 2 seconds, that Briggs favored his left knee getting off the transport, a slight overcompensation in how his right foot landed. She had noted that the second man, a lean sergeant first class with a new rifle sling, held the weapon with his right eye dominant but his body bladed left, a contradiction that meant training from one school and habit from another. She cataloged both observations without expression and filed them away the way a librarian files a book, not because she needed it immediately, but because she would. Her spotter, Corporal Marcus Reyes, had asked her afterward what she was thinking. She had said, Wind coming off the north ridge tomorrow. Adjust your dope before dawn. He had written it down. That was the nature of working with Elena Hayes. She did not explain herself. She did not need you to believe in her. She needed you to be ready when she was ready, and she was always ready slightly before anyone expected. She had learned early in her career, and it was a lesson she carried in her body more than her mind, that precision is not a skill. It is an identity. Skills can be lost to stress or fatigue or cold. Identity holds. When everything else strips away, when the radio dies and the team is gone and the temperature is dropping and pain is turning your thoughts into static, what remains is what you are, not what you have trained to do. What Elena Hayes was, at her core, was still. Stillness is not the absence of fear. Stillness is fear organized into something useful. Her instructor at Fort Benning, a Marine Master Sergeant named Whitfield who had the kind of quiet authority that never needed to raise its voice, had told her something she had never forgotten. He said it once, standing behind her on the range while she was adjusting for a crosswind that had shifted 3 times in 4 minutes. He said it without emphasis, the way men say things they believe so completely they do not feel the need to sell them. He said, "Distance is arithmetic. Stillness is art." She had shot a clean grouping at just over 1,200 meters the next morning. Now the present returns with the kind of urgency that closes around a person like cold water. Pain radiates from her collarbone each time she inhales. A deep, structural ache that tells her something is cracked, not broken through. Her thigh is worse. A deep cut from fragmentation, burning under frozen fabric. The cold doing the grim work of slowing the bleeding even as it threatens the leg itself. She presses her palm against the wound. Warmth spreads briefly, then disappears into the temperature around her. She inventories by touch. Eyes stay on the valley. Empty magazine. Missing sidearm. Gone in the blast, buried under metal and snow somewhere behind her. Communications unit cracked through. The casing split along a seam that looks like a fault line in dry earth. No signal, no backup. No spotter. 1 rifle. 1 round. The wind grows louder, pushing across the ridge with the kind of sound that has no mercy in it. Just pressure, constant and indifferent. It smells clean and dangerously thin at this altitude, the kind of air that makes the mind sharper and the body slower at the same time. Elena begins moving. Not running, not retreating. Moving with deliberate geometry, each step placed where the wind-hardened snow crust would hold her weight without sound. She had been studying this terrain since they dropped into the exercise area 48 hours ago. She had walked this ridge at dawn in temperatures that froze the moisture in her eyelashes and made the act of breathing a negotiation. She knew this mountain. What she did not yet know was whether the man tracking her knew it better. That question would be answered soon. The first shot arrives as a ghost. She feels the air pressure of it more than she hears the impact. A sharp disturbance to her left, close enough to spray fine crystalline powder across the side of her face. The ice crystals sting like needles against exposed skin. The report follows a fraction of a second later, arriving from the south-facing slope across the valley. Sharp, disciplined, a single crack with clean edges that told her everything she needed to know about the shooter's training. He had missed on purpose. Elena shifted direction without breaking stride, angling along the wind-hardened ridgeline where footprints collapsed quickly under drifting powder. Each step radiated pain upward through her ribs, but she had long since learned to separate the signal of pain from the noise of it. The signal said, "Injury." The noise said, "Stop, lie down, wait." She listened to the signal and discarded the noise. He was steering her. She had seen this tactic in advanced doctrine and had studied it in the debriefs of engagements where the technique had been used effectively in mountainous terrain. It was called terrain shaping, using precision fire not to eliminate a target, but to redirect one, pushing the quarry away from cover, away from high ground, away from any position of advantage, until the target stood in open ground with no options left. The second round impacted ahead and to her right. Upslope, deliberate. He was closing the angle of movement, narrowing her options like a hand closing into a fist. What would you have done in that moment? Kept running? Or stopped long enough to think? Elena stopped, not because the pain was winning, not because the cold had reached the part of her where decisions live. She stopped because she recognized something in the pattern of those two shots that changed the entire character of the problem. This man was not a good shooter executing a standard pursuit. He was an exceptional shooter executing a complex one. The spacing between the rounds told her his rate of movement. The angle differential told her his repositioning speed. The decision to use warning shots rather than live fire told her something else, something that mattered more than range or accuracy or any single technical variable. It told her that he was not hunting her body. He was hunting her mind. He wanted her disoriented, reactive, stripped of the one thing that made her dangerous, which was the same thing that made her worth hunting in the first place. Her stillness. Wind whistled through a narrow channel between two rock outcroppings to her left, bending sound in a way that compressed distance and distorted direction. Elena used it. She angled into the channel, letting the acoustic interference work in her favor, buying herself 30 seconds of concealed movement while she recalibrated everything. She pressed herself against cold granite. The stone was solid against her back, grounding and immediate. Her breath fogged briefly across her optic housing before the cold dissolved it. The air tasted of altitude, dry, metallic, thin. The kind of air that forced the lungs to work for every molecule of oxygen they needed. Her ribs screamed with each breath. She breathed anyway. The memory of Corporal Reyes surfaced briefly, his voice calm and steady in her earpiece during their last exercise together. A low-visibility drill in the Cascades where the fog had been so thick she was shooting by wind red and thermal signature alone. He had said after she had made the shot that she did not think like a shooter. He said she thought like the mountain thought. She had laughed at him, which was rare enough that he had remembered it and mentioned it twice afterward. She did not fully understand what he meant until this moment. The mountain does not react. The mountain positions. She stopped trying to escape the funnel he was building and started studying it instead. The cold pressed in from every direction, but she had long ago reached an arrangement with cold that most people never managed. Cold was not an enemy. Cold was a condition, like darkness or altitude or distance, a variable that entered the calculation, not a force that changed what was possible. She adjusted her grip on the rifle to account for the reduced sensitivity in her fingers. She adjusted her breathing rate to account for the altitude's effect on her oxygen uptake. She adjusted her expectations of her own body's performance downward by roughly 15%, and then proceeded on those adjusted numbers without complaint. Pain was a report. She read the report and continued working. What occupied her now, what her mind had locked onto with the sharp, clean focus that her instructors had called situational geometry, was the spatial relationship between the shooter, the terrain, and herself. 3 points defining a system. Systems had logic. Logic had patterns. Patterns, once recognized, could be anticipated. And anticipation, in her profession, was the distance between being hunted and being the hunter. She thought about where she would position if she were him. She thought about what the terrain looked like from the south-facing slope. She thought about the sight lines available, the cover options, the movement corridors that the geography made available versus the ones it closed. She built the picture in her mind the way she had been taught to build it. Not from her own perspective, but from his, then from above, then from the sides, until she had a three-dimensional model of the problem she could rotate and examine from any angle she chose. And in the rotating of that model, she found the corridor. Fine snow drifted sideways across the slope in a thin, continuous veil. Elena did not look at her scope adjustments. She watched the snow. The way it moved was information. Not approximate, not suggestive, but precise in the way that natural systems are always precise once you learn to read them instead of fight them. The drift was 3 to 5 miles per hour at surface level, angling in from the northwest. But the particles floating higher along the cornice edge above the valley were moving differently, responding to an upper-level flow that cut across the surface wind at roughly 15 degrees. 2 separate wind layers, 1 shot window. She noted it and moved on. From inside her outer shell, she withdrew a compression wrap, field dressed around her thigh since the blast, tight and functional, the kind of thing any trained soldier would carry. She removed it, tightened the second wrap she had beneath it, and placed the first one deliberately on the snow beside a split rock formation, visible from the south-facing slope across the valley. The knot she left on the compression wrap was not standard issue. It was a specialty knot taught only in advanced SERE training: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. The kind of course that took soldiers who were already exceptional and tested whether they remained exceptional when everything had been taken from them. The knot was called a fieldcraft anchor, and it was tied in a layer configuration that indicated not just training, but a specific level and school of training. It was, to someone who knew what to look for, a signature. She left it there on purpose. Not to communicate, to complicate. Somewhere across the valley, she heard nothing, but she understood that the absence of a third shot, when a third shot would have been available, was itself a communication. The hunter had slowed. He had found something that made him reconsider his assessment of what he was pursuing. The hunt had changed tone. She could feel it the way you feel. A temperature shift in a room before anyone opens a door, not in the air itself, but in the quality of the silence the air carried. She was no longer being treated as a wounded soldier making improvised decisions under pressure. She was being treated as a peer. The wind no longer sounded like background noise. It sounded like a clock. She moved north and slightly upward, working along the inside edge of the ridgeline where loose snow had consolidated into a firm surface that held her weight without compression sounds. Her body was a system operating under significant mechanical stress. The thigh wound had stiffened in the cold, reducing her lateral range of motion. The collarbone damage had altered the way she could carry the rifle without pain coloring her shooting position. She adjusted for both. She had been adjusting for things her entire career. Adjustment was not weakness. Adjustment was engineering. The terrain ahead opened into something she had noted 2 days ago during pre-exercise reconnaissance. A natural funnel. 2 parallel alpine walls narrowing into a corridor, no more than 30 meters across at its tightest point, with steep approach angles on both sides that made lateral flanking impossible without exposure. Above the corridor's western edge, a massive snow cornice, the kind formed by weeks of wind loading against a sharp ridgeline, extended outward over the valley in a curved arc that caught afternoon light like a breaking wave frozen in place. She looked at it the way a chess player looks at a piece that has been on the board the whole game, but has suddenly become relevant. The cornice was enormous. The kind of formation that avalanche safety courses use as primary examples of critical instability. The snow load on that overhang was measured not in pounds but in tons, and the only thing holding it in place was the static equilibrium of crystal structure, a bond that could be disrupted by the right input at the right frequency. A rifle shot, for instance. She had 1 round. She continued moving, and she began placing each step with a new and specific intention. The corridor was exactly as she remembered it. 30 meters of compressed alpine passage between walls of dark granite and ice-sheathed rock, the floor of it swept clean by the same wind channel that built the cornice above. The air inside the funnel smelled different from the open ridge. Older, somehow, as if the cold here had been accumulating since before anyone alive could remember. It was the kind of cold that had no relationship with human comfort. It simply was. Elena entered from the north end and moved to a position along the western wall, 20 meters in, where a shelf of rock provided natural prone cover. She cleared the snow from the shelf with her forearm, exposing granite that pressed cold and solid through her gear, and she settled into position with the mechanical patience of someone who had learned to wait without thinking about waiting. Her rifle moved upward, Not toward the south end of the corridor, not toward the direction the hunter would enter. Upward, toward the cornice. She studied it through her optic, assessing the load curve, the overhang angle, the relationship between the fracture point at the ridgeline and the mass of accumulated snow below it. She had made shots in training where she needed to calculate structural variables rather than human ones. Indirect effect shots, the instructors called them, where the round's purpose was not the target itself, but what the target would cause. She had made shots like this. She had never made one with this consequence. Her radio crackled. The sound was so unexpected that her trigger finger moved laterally, not toward the trigger, away from it. Discipline, older than thought. The communications unit was cracked and receiving only intermittently, pulling a fragment of signal from a source close enough to bleed through the damage. A voice entered, calm, professional. Clear in the way that voices are clear when they belong to someone who has spent years communicating in hostile environments where excess word was wasted resource. The voice said it had tracked her ammunition count since the convoy strike. It said it knew she had 1 round. It said the corridor had no exit she could reach before it did. It did not say these things with cruelty. It said them with the flat, measured tone of someone making an accurate assessment, like a navigator reading coordinates. Elena listened to the whole transmission before she spoke. When she did speak, her voice was the same temperature as the air around her, cold, clear, without decoration. She gave her name, Gunnery Sergeant Elena Hayes. She gave her rank, Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, Joint Detachment. She gave her service element. She did not elaborate. Silence followed from the other end. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of recognition. The kind that happens between 2 people in a specific profession when they realize simultaneously that they are dealing with someone who operates at the same level of exactness they do, and that this changes everything about the engagement. She heard breathing on the other end of the transmission. Slow. Controlled. The breathing of a trained shooter maintaining composure under a recalibration of everything he thought he knew about this hunt. Then the radio degraded back into static. She returned her eye to the optic. 1 round. 1 outcome. 1 question left. Would he come through the corridor, or would he recognize it for what it was? She had built the trail with care. Subtle compression marks in the snow. The compression wrap left at the decision point, a single directional indicator that suggested she had entered the funnel in flight rather than by choice. She had given him a story that looked like desperation because desperation was what a wounded soldier with 1 round and no exit would look like. She was not desperate. She was positioned. And she had been since the moment she left that ridge. The difference between a sniper and a shooter, her instructor Whitfield had said, was not the rifle. It was the conversation the sniper was already having with the terrain 4 hours before anyone else arrived. By the time a sniper fires, the outcome has already been settled by everything that came before. The shot is not the decision. The shot is the signature at the bottom of a letter that was written before the sun came up. Elena had written this letter 2 days ago on a reconnaissance walk, in air so cold it froze the moisture in her eyelashes. She waited. Below the cornice, fine crystals drifted off the overhang's edge and caught the low winter light, pale gold and weightless, falling slowly. A faint cracking sound traveled down from the ridge above, subtle and sharp, like stress finding the edge of its tolerance. She heard movement in the corridor. The faintest compression of snow under a boot, expertly placed, merely silent. He was good. She gave him that without reservation. He was exceptional, and he was moving with the kind of care that told her he had not fully committed to the corridor. He was reading it as he entered it, which meant some part of him still sensed that something was not aligned with the story the trail told. She did not move. She breathed. Her pulse was 48. Movement crossed the southern ridgeline above the corridor entrance. A shape, barely visible through blowing snow, the silhouette of a shooter angling toward a position that gave him a view down into the funnel. He was not inside it. He had gone high instead. He was reading her the way she had been reading him. Through absence, through what the terrain did not show, through the logic of how a person with her skill set and one remaining round would use this geography. He had almost seen it. Almost. His optic would have been moving across the floor of the corridor, tracing the compressed snow, following the story she had laid. And then, the way a reader's eye moves back to a word that did not quite fit the sentence, he would have found the angle wrong. The entry compression too even. The entry too deliberate for flight. Elena was already in position. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the cornice. Through her optic, the fracture line at the base of the overhang was a thin shadow, a hairline of stress visible only because the afternoon light had shifted to a low angle that caught the edge of it. She placed the crosshairs on the fracture point with the precision of a surgeon placing a needle. One breath in. One breath out. Trigger pressure building. Smooth, continuous, the way it had to be, the way it was the only time it worked correctly, the way she had practiced 10,000 times until the motion had left her conscious mind entirely and lived now in the pure mechanical memory of her hands. She fired. The sound cracked across the valley and rolled outward into the mountains, bouncing off granite faces and dissipating into the enormous, indifferent sky above Denali. A single, clean report, sharp at the front. Gone almost before it arrived, a heartbeat of silence. Then the mountain answered. The fracture line at the base of the cornice spread in a fraction of a second. A rapid, jagged propagation of stress releasing across the snowpack. The sound of it a deep, structural groan that arrived before the motion did. Then the motion came. The entire mass of the overhang, tons of consolidated snow and ice, broke loose from the ridgeline and fell, not dropped, but surged, accelerating as it went, compressing the air ahead of it into a pressure wave that arrived in the corridor before the snow itself. The avalanche roared. It was not a sound like gunfire. It was not a sound like thunder. It was something older than both. The sound of the mountain exhaling everything it had been holding, the deep bass vibration of mass in motion, the sound that made the ground itself tremble. Elena felt it in her chest before she heard it. She felt it in the granite beneath her elbows. She felt it in the fillings of her teeth. White motion consumed the corridor. And then silence returned. A silence so complete, it had weight. The kind of silence that only exists after enormous sound has passed. A silence that the ears interpret not as absence, but as the presence of something immense and finished. Her rifle was empty. She lay still for a long moment, listening. Wind returned to the valley. The fine powder of displaced snow drifted slowly across the ridgeline in a long, thin curtain, catching the last light of the afternoon. The air smelled of ice and disturbed mineral earth. A smell like the inside of a rock, cold and ancient and real. She thought of Rook, the call sign she had assigned the pursuing sniper in her mind. Professional recognition for a professional adversary. She did not know if he had cleared the corridor before the overhang released. She did not know if the terrain had given him what it gave. All terrain, eventually. An honest accounting of every decision made within it. She hoped he had moved in time, not from sentiment. From the specific and complicated respect that one specialist holds for another who has made them work for every inch. She set the rifle across her lap. Action open. Chamber empty. Done. 3 days later, the rotors announced themselves before she saw the aircraft. She heard the sound the way she heard most things now, through a filter built by days of silence and extreme cold, in which ordinary sounds arrive with unusual clarity. Blades cutting air. Rhythmic, steady. Growing louder. Then the smell of aviation fuel, carried on a wind shift, arriving as a kind of confirmation. She stepped out of the tree line slowly. Her left leg was stiff to the point of near dysfunction in the cold, the thigh wound having tightened into a locked mechanical quality over the days of low-temperature survival. Her collarbone sent a sharp objection up into her neck with every step. She moved anyway, placing each foot with the same deliberate attention she had placed every step since the convoy burned, because attention to placement was the only thing that had kept her moving forward, and she saw no reason to change that now. The rescue crew came across the snow toward her, 2 of them moving quickly, preparing for a casualty extraction. They had their hands ready for weight they expected to need to support. She was standing on her own when they reached her. One of them, a young army sergeant with a medic patch and eyes that had not yet learned to mask surprise, looked at her for a moment without speaking. He had expected collapse, or at minimum the kind of desperate exhaustion that makes people's knees unreliable and their words fragmented. He found instead a woman who was injured and cold and absolutely present. Eyes clear, posture controlled, rifle held the way it is held by someone who has never once forgotten. It is a tool with a job, not a prop in a story. She held the rifle forward. "Clean it," she said. Her voice was steady. It did its job. The sergeant took the rifle carefully, the way people take things they understand to be significant. He looked at it. The empty chamber, the single spent case that had been the whole of her response to an impossible situation. He said nothing. He nodded once. That nod carried weight. The second crew member, older, a chief warrant officer with the quiet eyes of someone who had pulled people out of very bad places many times over, looked at her assessment with the calm of long experience and said simply, "Let's get you home, Gunny." She followed them to the aircraft without assistance. Wind moved across the snow behind her, beginning the slow, patient work of erasing footprints. The mountain did not memorialize what had happened within it. It simply continued. Snow drifting, wind pushing, the enormous process of winter carrying on without ceremony or acknowledgement. That was fine. She had not come here for acknowledgement. She had come here because this was the work, and the work required someone who could do it. She had done it. The accounting was clean. The rifle was empty. The mission and the mountain had both been given what they were owed. The rotors lifted her up and away from the ridge, and below, the Alaska Range spread out in all directions under a pale winter sky, massive and silent and indifferent, the way real things are, the way the truth is, the way courage looks when it has nothing left to prove. Snow continued falling across the mountains long after the aircraft disappeared. It filled the tracks in the trees. It smoothed the disturbed earth at the base of the corridor. It buried the wreckage of the convoy under a clean white surface that gave no indication of what it covered. No evidence, no testimony, no monument. The Alaska Range does not keep records. It simply endures. There are battles in the history of this country that left no witnesses. There are victories that made no sound beyond the mountains where they happened, that were never reported in any briefing, never included in any ceremony, never attached to any official recognition. They exist only in the private accounting of the people who were there, and sometimes in the even more private accounting of the people who were on the other side of them. Gunnery Sergeant Elena Hayes never spoke publicly about the exercise in the Alaska Range. She returned to duty. She trained. She continued the specific, quiet, demanding work of being exactly what she was, one of the most capable long-range shooters in the combined U.S. military, a woman who had walked into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth with 1 round left and had made it count. Not because she had no other choice, because she had planned it that way. The lesson she carried out of those mountains was not a new one. It was the oldest lesson in her profession, the one that sits underneath all the technical training and the doctrine and the doctrine's doctrine, the one that cannot be written in a field manual because it does not live in the mind. It lives in the stillness. And stillness, as a man named Whitfield once told her on a range in Georgia, is art. Sometimes the final shot is not about ending something. Sometimes it is about knowing, with absolute certainty, that you were always worth the mountain's attention. And sometimes the quietest soldiers carry the loudest legacies. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to Hidden Sniper Stories right now. Every story on this channel exists to honor the courage, discipline, and sacrifice of the men and women who serve in silence, the ones whose names you may never know, and whose choices shape things you will never see. These stories keep that courage alive. They pass it forward. And they remind us that the most powerful forces in human experience are often the ones that make no sound at all. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Hidden sniper stories. Real courage. Quiet strength. Always.